Hey, we made it to episode 3. It occurs to me as I sit here at home socially distancing that a life well lived must include a myriad of distractions. I don't know about you, but I've always been a bit of a workaholic. Spending upwards of 60 hours a week involved in some kind of work exercise, and then finding distractions on the nights and weekends with family and friends. A beer and cigar after work, a trip to the mall to wander and grab a bite to eat, or to go sit in a dark room with strangers and eat some popcorn watching a movie. Those are my favorite relief valves for the day to day stresses, and I am looking forward to doing them freely again. The most disturbing part of this pandemic is the disruption of the distractions. And while I'm not arguing against the recommendations of science or public health, I struggle at times to understand why this pandemic has had so much more impact on the day to day than, say, the Spanish flu in 1917. The movie business has never been shut down the way it has in the COVID era through its entire history, and that includes World War II. I'm sure there are things we can do better to get back on whatever the new normal footing will be. For me, it's all about more and better data to help properly gauge the risk that we go out into every day. What do you think? How are you coping with the disruption of your distractions? Edward Branley is a writer, teacher, historian, and computer nerd. Branley is the author of 6 books on the history of New Orleans, as well as several young adult fiction novels. Teaching is Edward's passion and vocation. He earned a degree in secondary education from the University of New Orleans and taught at a Catholic high school in New Orleans after graduation. Then he moved to teaching adult continuing education for teachers, and now teaches computer classes on high-end topics such as converged computing environments, high availability, and enterprise storage management. Hey, Edward, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for taking the time today.
Oh, you bet. Thanks, Jeff. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, you are probably the closest I've ever come to an actual real Renaissance man in my life. I mean, you're a teacher, you're a writer, both of fiction and history, right? You're a historian,
Right?
and you're a computer guy. So you've kind of got it all covered. Tell us a little bit about your life, what you do, and what the normal day to day is like for you.
You bet. Okay. Well, I started out, talking about all these different things I do, but a lot of this all comes back to teaching because I got my degree in secondary education from the University of New Orleans, and yeah, I was a social studies teacher. Teaching American history and civics and that kind of stuff in a Catholic high school here in New Orleans. But of course, that doesn't really pay, right? So I was working nights and weekends at the Radio Shack. And so I started selling computers. And then what happens, of course, is then people start saying, hey, can you do this for me and do that for me? And Radio Shack doesn't like you moonlighting. So that when I stopped teaching, I started doing that, hey, can you do this and that for me as an independent consultant? And that's where that was the money thing. But I never really left teaching in that respect. I always would do local computer training and that kind of thing. And then in about 97, I was approached by a training partner for Digital Equipment Corporation, who I had been doing Unix and stuff on their machines for a long time. And so I was approached by this company, said, well, you could teach this, right? And I said, sure, I'm a teacher. I could it wouldn't be hard to ramp up on the latest version of the software and everything. So that's where the traveling and that kind of stuff started. And so that's where that came from. And then the history, well, of course, I never left teaching and I never lost my passion for history and everything else. But I was up in Boston because digital being in that whole bit, right? And so I'm up in Metro Boston and I'm teaching teaching a class up there, and I see all of these books in the this is years ago, right? There's a big old Borders, right? In downtown Boston. So I'm looking at these books, and they're all got these sepia tone covers, and so I start saying, this is all local history stuff. So I go back to the hotel, check the Arcadia Publishing website, and they don't have much on New Orleans. So I, kind of sent a flippant note to the acquisitions editor at the time, and she sent a flippant reply back with a author's kit saying, well, if you think you can do better, and so, well, challenge accepted. I wrote a book on the history of one of our streetcar lines, and it's kind of grown into that. But with the travel, it was easy, right? Because what do you do when you travel? And this, it's
Right.
like you lock yourself in the hotel, or you go to a pub. And if you go to a pub, it's not even the drinking, it's the money you spent, right? So now I could lock myself in the room and write, and that was wonderful. It was ironic, by by 10 going into 2012, I'm doing more, we're centralizing things a little bit. They're coming to only a few specific cities, still traveling. I'm still like Diamond with Delta at this point, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
But as it grew on is when more people became accustomed to WebEx.
Yeah.
Basically, since I want to say maybe 17 or so, the only time I travel now is if I'm teaching a hardware class because most of my work is with Hitachi Vantara, and so if their field service people will all gather together where there's a Hitachi data center, and then I'll teach the stuff, right? That kind of thing. But all the customer stuff is browser based and everything else. We set it all up. We use Citrix, and so that's that kind of thing. What was ironic about that is I was still doing a lot of European travel. Europeans hated remote classes. They wanted the human interaction, right? So I was traveling more to Scandinavia than I was around the United States at that point, which actually, in a way, that was kind of fun, because then it wasn't a grind. It's like, hey, you want to go spend 2 weeks in Vienna, and I'm like, oh, let me think about it. So.
Yeah. Well, give me 30 seconds to decide on that one.
Exactly. Yeah. I have a friend who was a Hitachi manager. She'd get me to commit to coming over for a week, and then she would try to parlay that into 2 or 3. And one time, she said, okay, can you go to Vienna for a week? Well, before that, can you fly to Amsterdam and teach in the Netherlands for a week, and then pop down to Vienna and go home from there? Then she books another class after that, and the way she talks me into it is to send me a link to the website for the Vienna Christmas Festival at the Schönbrunn Palace. Okay. Now, it's here I am with the history, right? And she's like, it's Vienna's lovely at Christmas. I'm like, oh, you're evil. So I ended up 4 weeks living out of a suitcase, but 2 of them are in Vienna.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Did you ever take family along when you're doing those kind of trips?
I've taken Helen. I've taken my wife. Actually, what's happened with the way that used to work is she would come up, because she works, right? She's a CPA. So what would happen is, in particular, going back to the Boston days, is if I had classes back to back, I wouldn't come home, and she would come up, and we'd spend a weekend in Boston or a weekend in Atlanta or something like that. With the European stuff, there's been some times where I'm there for 2 weeks in the UK, so we'd have that weekend in London kind of thing, and then she came for a few days one time when I was teaching in the Netherlands, and it's been fun. She's been able to have some fun with that.
That's cool. I've always felt guilty. I worked for Disney for 10 years, and I spent a lot of time in Orlando at the parks, because we had an animation studio there, and we also had the main corporate data centers were located on property out there. And so I would, at different points in those 10 years, I would travel to the parks either twice a year, or in the end, when I was at corporate, probably 5 or 6 times a year.
Oh, nice.
And never had the opportunity to take the family.
That's a shame. I mean, I guess, you guys live in LA, right? But so it's it's Disneyland, but you don't get the Florida experience.
Yeah. Orlando's different because you've got all the different parks, and you got the hotels and all of that. And it's, it's ironic because my son and daughter are 5 years apart, which was intentional because my sister and I were born 5 years apart. And I realized that the balance in ages really helped in the long
Oh
run.
yeah.
Having an older brother for the younger sister was a good thing. But because of that, he was too young to go on the rides. And then when he was finally old enough to go on the rides, she was
She
too
was too
young to go
young.
on the
Yeah.
ride.
Uh-huh.
And so the last trip back east while I was still at Disney, we were going to try to we were going to New York for a family event because our family was still back there.
Right.
And then we were going to go down to Orlando and go to the park and then come back to LA. But this was after 9/11 and travel was just miserable, right? I mean, especially with little kids, especially when you're doing a bunch of one ways.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
And we realized that, both my wife and I grew up in New York City, but neither of us have ever taken the kids there and shown them the city. Right? We would go back every year to visit family, but we never did touristy things.
Yeah.
So that year, instead, we did the Museum of Natural History, we did the Statue of Liberty, right? We went and had vacation in New York, and it was great. But, in the end, I never got them to Disney World.
My dad was born and raised born and raised in Manhattan, and took us back. I think I was maybe 9 or 10 years old at the time, and my I've got two sisters. One's an Irish twin. She's 11 months after me, and basically they took us up, did the same thing. We drove up to Boston, then drove back down and hit New York. That trip was the first time that my dad, who grew up, first time he left New York when he was 17 to join the Air Force. That was but that trip with the family was the first time he'd ever gone up in the Statue of Liberty. You know how it is. You're from there. You don't do. Yeah, I don't do that. Yeah.
I live in Los Angeles, and we have amazing beaches. And when you live here every day and you're walking distance from the beach, you don't always go and do it, right? Because it's always there, unless you're young and you like to do the surfing and all of that. And as soon as the beaches became unavailable because of the pandemic, everybody had to be there all the time. And it led to the craziness that's unfortunately left California in this state where we're resurging because, everybody congregates. Talk about what it was like there in New Orleans, because I know New Orleans got hit pretty hard early on, and it was right around Mardi Gras, right?
Right. What happened was Mardi Gras was middle of the road, third week of February in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at that point, if you think back, the virus was, Wuhan was a thing, and nobody was really looking at it from this could happen here standpoint. There were some people sounding some general alarms, but you didn't have anything serious at that point. So there was no advisory that, maybe having 500,000 people in the streets of New Orleans crowding together and passing by and yelling at floats was a bad idea, right? So it basically, so Mardi Gras happened, and it was a pretty good, everybody had a good time and everything. But of course, that's when people from other parts of the country brought the thing back with them. We never hit the disaster levels like that New York had. We had way too many deaths, but we never really hit that overflow. Like there was actually a controversy. We have the really big, it's called the Ernest Morial Convention Center. It's huge. The very first convention in there in 1984 was a helicopter convention. And the thing was big enough to have they converted several of the main halls for the convention center into a field hospital and then never had to use it, which, thank God, knock on wood and all of that. Right. But we still had high numbers. And then the state in general, we caught the worst. We did catch the worst of it. In hindsight, if we could have cut off Mardi Gras or something like that, maybe the whole thing, might have been situated better, but we've done a pretty good job of rolling with it since. So
How are the people of New Orleans responded? So did New Orleans have a lockdown order?
Um, well, yeah. The important thing to remember about New Orleans, we talk about Metro New Orleans. It's basically what we call the tri-parish area. Civil parishes are counties. Okay, so if you hear me talk about Jefferson Parish and Orleans Parish, that's the counties, right? So,
Got it.
so Orleans Parish, which is the entire city of New Orleans, there's no non-incorporated area. Orleans Parish set up some the mayor Cantrell. She immediately put in some fairly tight lockdown orders. Basically, all the bars are closed. This kind of thing, So that helped. That helped a lot. One of the things that happened down here is, I'm sure you've read and you've experienced the whole issue of the virus hitting African Americans disproportionately and people trying to sort out why. Well, New Orleans, if you look at the metro area, is about 1.1 million people. And of that, Orleans Parish and the city, the municipality is about 450,000 people. And of that 450,000 that live in Orleans Parish, it's about 60% African American. So that's one of the things that we had that issue going on, and then we had a couple of nursing homes that turned into these awful, tragic clusters, right? And so we had that. But basically, if the quick reaction by city government took care of a lot of this, the parish governments outside of the city, the suburban areas, are very, very Republican, and being in the South, very, very pro-Trump. And so lockdown orders were not taken well. They were not well received, maybe is the words.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about what the environment is like down there, because New Orleans proper, the mayor is a Democrat, but the state is
No, now our governor is actually a Democrat. John Bel Edwards.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay.
John Bel Edwards is a Democrat, but he's a very conservative Democrat. For example, he is an anti-abortion Democrat, which will just light up people, that lights up Democrats nationally. But he is a Democrat. He's very, very progressive on some things, but he is pro-life, pro-gun. Okay, so there's no, but then he is very much pro not having 7,000 African Americans incarcerated in the state. As a matter of fact, I was just reading this morning. There's a lawyer in Jefferson Parish, which is our Orange County. Okay, it's our So there's already a guy that's suing the governor for a mask mandate. To invalidate it, right? That kind of
the mask thing absolutely amazes me. It's an inconvenience, but it's the least inconvenience that you could be faced with.
Let me tell you,
and it'll reduce the risk of transmitting the disease.
Right.
It's just so idiotic that we have to go through this.
Well, down here, I kind of look at it too. Like, when we say like there are people who are against masks, it's not so much that they're against public health issues as much as it is they want to stick it to the Democratic governor.
So let me ask you this. Do you find that the Democratic governor reflects the actual way that the majority of people think in that community, or was it just an anomaly that person won and it's actually more of the other direction?
It's more of the other direction. But what happened was basically the politics of the situation were that the Louisiana Republican Party on a statewide level, they have a hard time fielding candidates that are good. And so, for example, in our state and parish-wide elections are off cycles, so that the governor's race and everything was last year in 19, so it'd be 19 to 23 kind of thing. And the Republicans are incredibly conservative, but in a way they are too conservative to go beyond that. Like if you had any kind of lobbying aspirations or presidential aspirations, that kind of thing. So what ends up happening is that Republicans, that like the two men that are our senators, they don't really want to be bothered with being governor because it's just easier to be a Republican in Washington right now. So
Okay.
you end up like the governor's race in last year. John Bell Edwards was running for re-election, running for his second term, and then two Republicans ran against him. One guy is a congressman from the northwest part of the state, up Shreveport, Louisiana. He's an MD, and he got caught up in a pill mill scandal, so that tarnished him. The other guy was just a moron. There's no other way to say it. He's a businessman, just a guy who had really no, it's like everybody sitting here going, can you imagine if Eddie Rispone had won? It would be like Florida. You know how Florida is reacting?
Yeah.
What's going on in Florida, that would be Louisiana. We'd have the body bags and the overflow, and it would just be a mess. But so to answer your question, though, the general feeling is that people don't like to be told what to do. But I think when you get down to it, they like dying less, right? So, it's just one of those things, right?
All right, I'm going to pick on your history a little bit while we're talking about New Orleans, which is a city that definitely is rich in history. I mean, if you've got to live someplace and become a historian, that is a place to be.
Absolutely.
Without question.
Yes.
And of course, we're living through the first pandemic, I'm guessing, in both of our lifetimes. But New Orleans, through its history, has had a lot of epidemics. So I'm guessing that is a factor of it being such a busy port city and it also being down in the tropics. Does that make sense?
Correct on both. The weather, the climate and the tropics. The French used to refer to New Orleans specifically as the Ile d'Orléans, the Isle of Orleans, because while we're not an island in the geographic definition, we are effectively surrounded by water on all four sides of the city. So if you look at like I said, what we call the tri-parish area, basically in the west and in the east, everything is so much swamp and marsh that there's no, there's huge gaps that separate the city from the rest of the state. And then, of course, to the north of the city is Lake Pontchartrain, and then the Mississippi River to the south of the city, so that we're totally surrounded by water. We're surrounded by swamps. And what do swamps bring? Swamps have mosquitoes. Yeah. And then there you go. Malaria, yellow fever. Yeah, we've been through every epidemic. And a lot of it has to do with mosquitoes. It has to do with, spreading these infections.
So how does COVID compare to past things like, say, Spanish flu or, some of the other things that you know about from the history of the city?
Okay, well, the first biggest epidemics, the first biggest breakouts are, of course, malaria and yellow fever. More so, yellow fever. One of the stories we have, of course, New Orleans being French and then Spanish colonial, was very still to this day a very Catholic city. The main parish church eventually became what is now St. Louis Cathedral. That was the French Quarter Church. Along the way, in I want to say 1821, they built what was called a mortuary chapel. It's now a parish just outside the French Quarter, but they called it the mortuary chapel because it was right next to the first Catholic cemetery, so that when the yellow fever outbreaks hit, you didn't have to bring the deceased into the cathedral for the funeral. You'd have the funeral in a fairly nice church on the outskirts of the city next to the cemetery. Then you'd have have your funeral mass and then bury them from there. Yeah, we've had way too much experience with that over time. All throughout the 19th century, we had tons of just yellow fever outbreaks at different points. And now Spanish flu, that's less about our climate and more about that sucker just spreading like this pandemic, right? So, we took a hit there. What's different about this pandemic and all of these yellow fever outbreaks and everything is these other outbreaks and diseases did not have the disparate racial impact that COVID-19 does. Yellow fever outbreak in 1868 hits the city. It's awful. yellow fever outbreaks in the 1880s when Sicilian immigration starts coming in. Bad. Those didn't discriminate, as it were, right? It's like there wasn't that reaction of, oh, this is hitting just this particular group kind of thing. Where COVID is, like I say, it's disproportionately hitting African Americans in particular down here. That becomes basically white people are saying, do I have to worry about this? That kind of thing. And so
Yeah.
that's in terms of comparison, the earlier epidemics in 1918, there were all the people who refused to wear masks again, but that's that aside, basically you lived in the you lived in the area, you knew you did what you could to not catch it, basically, at that point.
Do you feel that because the city has more of a history of these kinds of things, that it's better prepared for dealing with something like this?
It's a combination, yeah. But the big thing, in terms of any kind of emergency preparedness, we get hurricanes.
Yes, that's true.
So, we do have emergency response down here. It's like when people raise an alarm and they think that in general it's either government or the private sector, something, like people aren't taking something seriously. It's easy to raise the alarm and say, remember what happened when, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's helped a lot. Where we run into problems with that is with the tourists. Because it's like, you're like, you shouldn't be out on Bourbon Street right now. And they don't get it because they're going back home to, wherever, to St. Louis or something. So, whatever. We know that there are times when you have to take steps, right? You have to do things.
Is it too early to say that, at least institutionally, we're kind of learning lessons? Because my gut tells me we're uncovering things that we've never in our lifetime experienced before. And I don't think this is the last time we're going to have this kind of viral disease pass through the population.
I absolutely agree with you on that. So are we learning something? I like to think so. And specifically, the reason I say that is because we have learned an incredible amount about, being prepared for a hurricane. We had Hurricane Betsy in 1965. Those levees are now 3 and 4 times higher than they were in 1965. Katrina, we saw that, we had the biggest flooding problems for the city of New Orleans came from failure of flood walls for outfall canals. They were never severely tested. And I think we've learned from it. Like, again, for example, turning the largest convention center in the southeastern United States into essentially a field hospital in a matter of about 2.5 weeks. We knew how to do that. So one of the things I've always felt, medical centers like Tulane are going to be the ones to come up with ways to mitigate the thing, and treat it better.
And they have been. The stuff they're learning in the hospitals as quickly as they are, and the effects it's been having has been tremendous. I think that this is going to lead to a core change in the way we do medical science. We're demonstrating that we have both technology and need to speed things up. And we may actually pull off having a functioning and working vaccine in just under a year or a year, rather than having to wait 2 years before it gets through the process and gets out there.
Yeah. And I think you're right. And again, I think that comes to what you're talking about bigger picture issues, is that there's always been concern about super viruses and super bacteria that's resistant to antibiotics. And I think the medical industry has been thinking this way before. And,
I think that a realist recognizes there are always going to be acceptable losses. But the reality is it's what you do, because the alternatives will ultimately be worse.
Yeah, the alternative is just awful. I mean, the more people that die, it's just, it's not good.
Yeah, if you get 5 people who die or 50 people who die in a vaccine trial versus 500,000 people who die because that vaccine took an extra year to come out.
Now, what I don't think we're going to learn, ramping up contact tracing and improving testing and everything else. And I think that here is a byproduct of a president who sees everything through the lens of re-election. And if we didn't have that, things would be better.
This would have been a moonshot. You know what I mean? There are 2 major things that frustrate me right now. In California, we've had months to get this under control. There's no reason why we can't be baseline flat like in New York. If we'd all taken it seriously, the problem out here is there's a decent enough chunk of people that refuse to accept that this is real because it hasn't personally touched them yet. And by the time you get to the level where it's personally touched enough people that the majority is paying attention, there's a lot of dead people out there. The Trump attached failure to all of this, aside from the fact that he hasn't marshaled the resources of the greatest society on the planet to be able to do this kind of thing, is that he's trying to pretend it doesn't exist because he thinks it's going to matter to his election. And instead of telling everybody, yeah, you got to wear the mask. I don't want to wear a mask either, but I'm going to wear a mask because, we have to. It's the only way to help ourselves.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah. And it's like you're talking how, when something doesn't personally touch you. I remember reading last week or the week before, there was an article in the Washington Post that was talking about 30% of African Americans in the United States know somebody, either directly or tangentially to them, know somebody that's died from this thing. And so when you focus on New Orleans, you figure, okay, if that many people personally know somebody, well, when you live in a city that's 60% African American, then you start getting that whole European reaction.
So in your life, because you work a lot from home anyway, and you're a writer and you teach, I assume you're teaching from home these days, other than the obvious, has the pandemic dramatically changed your life?
Honestly, well, break it into personal and professional, okay? In terms of professionally, no. Basically, we've been using a remote model and teaching via WebEx now for about 2.5 years. The one thing that's not happening for me, that the big change was where you actually have to teach a field service engineer how to fix something, right? So you have to touch the storage array. You have to touch the blade servers, that kind of thing. So I haven't traveled for work literally since January. But that hasn't stopped the job. The writing side of things, that's the part that, I don't want to sound like I'm whiny, but, this stuff is depressing and it's hard to write when you're depressed. It's like, it's like, I think everybody understands that one, getting motivated, get up and motivate. And fiction, where it's coming out of your mind and your mind is incredibly dark at different points, it doesn't, especially like the YA stuff, my dragons fiction and everything else. It's like, how do you get in the, it's like I keep wrestling with, do I put my high school young adult characters, do I pretend this doesn't exist, or do I put them in masks? And I don't know what to do with that yet, and this is 3 months of it. I written a couple of like historic thing, you kind of go in the Wayback Machine and time travel a little bit with history writing. That's an escape, but the fiction has just been, just such a mess.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's tough, right?
So what's the next 6 months look like, do you think?
Well, like I said, New Orleans, we're one of these places that just, we've rolled through everything, and in particular with 2005 and Katrina, if we, there's a lot of people down here, the attitude is, hey, if we got through that, we'll figure it out, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah, so. Cool. What can I plug for you? Here's you've got a lot of stuff going on. Talk about some of your projects and point people to them.
Okay. The biggest thing is on social media. I am NOLA History Guy, all one word, on also Twitter, Instagram, the Facebook page, everything, and nolahistoryguy.com, and that's the jumping off point for everything, for all of the history stuff I do. So you can see the books I've written, because I've written 6 books on the history of New Orleans there, the new projects. Right now, like I said, it's a lot of, I'm doing a lot of small writing things, like the last thing that just I sent out to a Big Easy magazine 2 weeks ago was a little profile of a guy, a German guy who came to New Orleans after the Civil War and started a mail order seed business that his family continued into the 1960s, and just little things, right? Just little profiles, because I tend to be looking for something and I fall down rabbit holes, so.
Very cool. Edward, thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you, Jeff. This has been fun.